This video is sponsored by Eldritch Foundry. This is the miniature that I painted, and this is the official Warhammer box art. Pretty similar, right? So how can you recreate Warhammer box art yourself? The following steps are not easy, but let me show you. Games Workshop sent me the Leviathan box set, and after inspecting it for a little bit, I realized that all the minis are push fit, and this will make the first step much easier. From the get-go, I knew that I wanna paint this apothecary, since I need it for my army, and the rest can wait. As I mentioned, the minis are push fit, and that means that painting them sub-assembled is easier, as opposed if they weren't. Now you might ask, why even bother with sub-assemblies? Upon observing the OG paint job, you'll see that this little canister has all the little windows painted, and if we glue it now, not only would it be almost impossible to paint the inner ones, but also everything under his arm. And this is the case for many Warhammer minis, so depending on the pose, you might have to do sub-assemblies yourself, at least if you wanna do this box art stuff. So after properly cleaning the mold lines and assembling what we can, it's time for... I primed the mini with a GW white primer and the base with black. Usually I prime just black, but here it would be very stupid. I decided to apply white scar from the pot on top because there are some differences between the paint pot and the primer, even though they do share the same name. If you are using primer as your base coat, you should do this too. So even if you spray the mini with Mephiston Red, for example, it's a good idea to come back and use Mephiston Red from the pot, so you can use it to fix potential mistakes later without seeing the slight difference in color. Base coating is the universal step for any given miniature, and I don't even bother using too many different colors. Yet. All the red parts were base coated with corn red, and the difference between them will be made once we get to later stages. The sub-assemblies here allow us to paint everything, but honestly, if it wasn't box art recreation, I wouldn't bother. However, another advantage is that it allows you to be more accurate. This is especially useful when painting white, because all the mistakes you make are a pain in the ass to fix, especially when using black. Speaking of black, I use it to cover all the metal parts as well. Sure, I will use actual metallic paint once it's over, but personally I feel like metallics work better over black undercoat. This is very, and I mean very lengthy process. I am trying to be as neat as possible because, as I said, accidentally spilling black onto white means trouble. And even though I would like to say that I didn't screw up at all, of course I did. In fact, I estimate that the third of my time base coating the thing was spent on fixing the mistakes I made. So if you make some yourself, don't bash yourself too hard, just fix them and there you go. It will take you a lot of time, but if you actually wanna recreate any kind of box art, this is what you sign up for, chief. Base coating the rest, it's not always obvious which colors to choose. Even though GW usually tells you which colors to pick on the box, those aren't really accurate all of the time. So what you can do instead is just wing it, or put the box art into Photoshop or any software that lets you use a color picker, and then use that color. Technology! That way you aren't even restricted by a paint brand. So for example, if you like AK Interactive or Vallejo like I do, just pick a similar color from that range. Being done with that, I moved to metallics. Using regular paint before metallics is a very good idea, because you don't want little shiny particles in your matte paint. The only two paints that I use for any kind of true metallic steel is this Vallejo Air Steel and a black ink. Now I know it says air, but it's fantastic for paintbrush as well. You'll see. I combine these two so I have a mid-tone which I can both shade and highlight later. The mix has beautiful coverage without obscuring the details. Just look at it. Look! This is one layer. That's insane! So after spending even more time on steel, it's time to share my secret Krabby Patty formula for gold. It consists of Retributor Armor Gold from Citadel and Gold from Vallejo Metal Color range. Now these by themselves are great colors, but the problem is that the Vallejo Metal Color is too runny and the Citadel color is way too thick. Combine the two and you get a mix that spreads very nicely without obscuring the details, just like the steel mix. And once I built a proper coverage, it's time for the most dangerous part of the process. The first thing I did is replace my water. This is important because, as I said, you don't want little shiny particles in your standard paint. Now to start shading the white armor, I use this sort of bluish gray paint. I am thinning it down because otherwise you'll absolutely demolish the white. Pretty much any paint that you apply directly over white is really intense. And that's actually the reason why painting a really clean white is difficult. You have to go slow, be precise, and apply multiple passes in all the recesses, because otherwise you'll kill it. And even though it takes eternity, there is one advantage that I'll talk about later. As you have seen at the start of the video, Warhammer box art focuses on two things: being clean and readable. GW employees usually achieve the overall definition by shading every recess and edge highlighting all, well, edges. So if they do it, I have to do it too. It's kinda inevitable that you'll spill the paint a little bit, but because you are a smart fella and you thin the paint quite a bit, there is not too much pigment spilled. So simply fixing it with white will do the trick. Inspecting the box art again, you'll see that this Marine is too fucking lazy to clean his armor. So you know what, our Marine will be lazy too. And by glazing a bit of dark brown, I try to emulate this effect. And again, I have to go slowly, because fixing it would be hell. When it comes to the dark parts, I simply water down a black paint and apply it into the recesses too. Now you could say, but Zumikito, why bother doing that when you can just take a shade and apply it over the entire miniature, right? No. See, if you actually look at any painted Space Marine on the box art, you'll notice that the only shading is in the recesses, and the armor overall is pretty flat. This is changing a little bit, and you can see some shading here and there, but the point is that as long as you wanna copy the box art, you can't really use all over washes for your minis. Unless we are talking about parts that are crowded with details. The part that I am using Agrax Earthshade for though is this purity seal. This is because I don't mind the wax or the parchment paper being tinted by brown. Still, observe how I focus on the recess, separating it from the armor. This kind of separation of elements is really good for the overall readability of your minis. So do it. Either way, when applying any kind of wash, I usually go back to the initial colors and re-establish them a little bit. You can do it now or in later stages, but make sure to do that for the overall cleanliness. I should also mention that I was much more generous with the washes when it came to the golden parts and the cloth, but that's also because there will be more work done on them later. Other than that, I would highly recommend getting a brush that has a nice sharp tip. If you tried to recess shade or edge highlight with something like this, what the f are you doing? Before moving further, let's talk about our sponsor. Have you ever wanted to have an army of religious bearded hippos, gunslinging dragon gladiators, or sci-fi gigachads? Well, you can have all of that and much more with Eldritch Foundry. Eldritch Foundry is a character creator that you can use to craft a mini with zillions of different loadouts. You can customize lineage, gear, weapons, spells, hairstyle, chin size, and they are adding more and more options all the time. You can either receive your own custom mini you created at sharp 30 micron resolution for $25, or you can get an STL for $5 and print thousands of them. More! And if you find yourself liking multiple options but can't really decide, you can have a subscription for as little as $10 a month and download as many different STLs as you want. Whether you need a constant supply of different characters for your D&D campaign, you wanna build your own unique wargaming army, or you just want something unique and absurd, Eldritch Foundry has the tools to customize any of these. So check them out and use the code ZUMIKITO for a 15% discount. And thank you Eldritch Foundry for sponsoring this video. After resetting my palette, I still had one more thing to do before edge highlights. Looking at the box art, you can see this very slight hint of blue on some armor plates. Not sure how Heavy Metal Team does it, but I simply glazed a bit of turquoise there. I can't stress enough how little paint I used for this. Anyway, right after that, I started edge highlighting. AK Interactive White is hands down the best white paint. You can't change my mind. It's very smooth, doesn't get choky, and is a step lighter above White Scar, so it makes sense to use it. Unfortunately, light Citadel paints tend to get choky, so I can't really recommend them. With this one, I am picking out every single edge on the white armor. It's not too visible on camera, but believe me when I say that the impact is there. Seriously guys, trust me. And it'll also make some of the shaded recesses thinner. As I said multiple times already, painting box art level white is quite difficult and it takes a lot of time. But there is one thing aside from cocaine that makes it easier. Luckily for us, there is only one edge highlight level necessary. If you look at other Space Marines from the box art, those have like 3 different colors used for the edge highlights. I still think that blue armor would be overall much faster and easier, but at least 1 paint instead of 3 means that this particular step is faster. Next, I use Mephiston Red to cover most of the apothecary symbols. What I did then is use various degrees of orange to highlight the edges, and I will do something similar with all of the details. Even with the Purity Seal wax, I simply mixed in some white into my initial base coat of Corn Red to highlight it. And this was done in multiple steps to make it pop. For the leather, I picked some pure brown and went over the edges as well. Then I added some white and did it again, but made the additional edge highlights thinner. Now keep in mind that the less water you have in your brush, the thinner are the edge highlights you'll make. This is especially true when you paint with the body of the brush instead of the tip. You can kinda think of it as a precision dry brushing in a way. Of course, I won't be including all my recorded brush strokes in the video. That would be insane. But if you wanna see all the raw unedited footage, it'll be on my Patreon. Now, when it came to this cloth part, I adjusted my approach. Instead of just edge highlights, I applied a layer of Mephiston Red to the exposed part and then covered smaller and smaller parts as I mixed in more and more orange. This is pretty standard layering, but it's quite different from the approach we used on the armor, for example. Of course, multiple edge highlights are still a thing on all the official box arts, so even here they are included. Since it's nearly impossible to tell which exact colors were used on the box, I just picked some similar looking orange and added more and more yellow. Very similar approach was used on the parchment paper, adding white to Shapti Bone. This time though, I deviated a little bit by painting some writings on the paper. This is not like a huge change, so it won't be really noticeable, but I like it. Multiple gray edge highlights were used for the under armor, and actually it's the same recipe that I am using for the gun. So starting with quite a thick edge highlight of Dark Reaper, thinner edge highlight of Intermediate Blue, and a final highlight of Intermediate Blue and white. This entire process looks pretty fast in the video, but believe me, dry brushing an entire army would be faster than this mini. As you can already guess, I did the same thing with the metallics. For the gold, I simply used just Retributor Armor and then Liberator Gold. Of course, the latter edge highlight is thinner. For the steel, I don't need anything else other than these 2 bad boys again. This time though, either don't add any black ink or just a small amount. It still has amazing coverage and it'll make them metallics pop. After literal days of painting a single gaming miniature, Jesus Christ, we can finally have some fun. This step adds the necessary flavor to the miniature. The light thingy on the backpack can be simply layered up. I just started with a warm yellow and added lighter and colder yellow towards the middle. As always, since I painted into my finished parts, I came back and fixed them. When it comes to various forms of lenses, there is an universal approach to them. Let's say that this circle represents this lens. After the base coat, you wanna layer up lighter and lighter color towards one side. How exactly light you wanna go is up to you. But there has to be a solid difference between this side and that side. Before applying the lightest color though, you wanna outline the entirety of the lens like this. Finally, to essentially paint a reflection, put a pure white dot to the opposite side, right in the darkest part of it. If you wanna make the effect even more pronounced, you can glaze a bit of black in there around it. And voila! This other blue thingy, I am not sure what it's supposed to represent, so I just painted blue and apply lighter and lighter layer, mixing in white and cover less and less. Most certainly the crown jewel of every Space Marine are the eye lenses. Or the face, if this Space Marine had one. You can imagine that the lens consists mostly of 3 parts: inner light, bottom outline, and a white dot. You can use multiple layers for any of these, well, maybe with an exception of the white dot, which doesn't really need it. And in practice, I start with dark red base coat and use red, then orange, and finally yellow to represent the inner light. You might find it very hard to believe, but all the other lenses follow the same principles. There is a simple gradient where one side is lighter and on the other side is a white dot. Even the glass on the canister follows the same principle. It's just a simple gradient with a strong outline. This time though, I use lines instead of dots to represent the glass window thingy better. And again, don't be afraid to come back to any part to fix it, it's just part of the process. For me anyway. And because I still didn't glue the arm, I can do this for all sides of this canister. I know that I am repeating myself here quite a bit, but guess what? Even the display here is just a green gradient. The only thing I struggled with is making the colors just right. After applying the decals to the shoulder pad and the knee pad, I still had to paint the base. But you know what? I assume that you are gonna paint the base to fit your existing army. So I just used a dark blue color scheme to fit my own Sons of the Phoenix army. But the one thing that you shouldn't mess up is painting the rim of the base. This is also called rimming, and I would highly recommend looking it up on Google to avoid any mistakes that people make. Either way, I think that this miniature came out quite nice, but getting there took eternity. This is a good exercise if you want to learn brush control and how to be neat, but I wouldn't try to paint an entire army like this. Now, I went over some important stuff that I didn't fully explain, like which brushes to pick, how to glaze, and stuff like that. But if you need a refresher, I explain everything you need to know for miniature painting in this video, so check it out. And see you there!